Amen. All right, take your Bibles tonight and turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. I appreciate your comments occasionally about enjoying going through Ecclesiastes. I will tell you, there are times when you do a chapter or two that everything seems to be redundant, but when you really dig into it, it is not that way at all. And so I do appreciate you and your comments. I've entitled the message tonight, or the lesson, Wisdom That Works When Life Doesn't. And I think we all would agree that there's sometimes it just seems like life just doesn't work the way it should. A lot of things don't make sense. A lot of things happening around us. We don't always understand why things are the way they are. And that can be in our personal lives. It can be in national life. It can be in church life. It can be no matter what you're doing in your job. Sometimes it just seems. James Dobson years ago wrote a book that became a really quick bestseller called "When God Doesn't Make Sense." And the truth is, that's not a knock on God. It's really talking about how we just sometimes can't make sense out of why God allows certain things or even does certain things. And I mean, how many times have you heard somebody say, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Or why does God allow good things to happen to bad people? Jeremiah asked him that question. Lord, how long are you going to let evil roam to and fro in the streets of Jerusalem, your city? How long are you going to do that? How many times have you heard, as we have seen a moral decline in our own country, how long is the Lord going to stay his hand of judgment? Well, we don't know, but I'm thankful he has, because when God judges, even those of us who are righteous sometimes will suffer because of that, and his people did. But obviously we have to look at it from an eternal perspective. But I want to start, as I have been, because I think that Ecclesiastes, things like Proverbs, the books of wisdom, many times cause questions. And so the last few weeks, I've been giving you 2 or 3 questions to ponder as an introduction to the lesson. And here are 3 tonight. Have you ever discovered that one of life's greatest lessons came through one of life's greatest disappointments? You have to ponder that a little bit. And probably, if you're like me, some of life's greatest disappointments, I didn't learn the lesson right away. I didn't understand it. But as I got older and pondered it and kept thinking about it and saw some things happening, I realized that God was teaching me something. Number 2, why is it that we often grow more during difficult seasons than during easy ones? And then the third one is this: could it be that God sometimes teaches us more through pain than through prosperity? You see, our culture tells us that success equals happiness, comfort equals blessings. Think about this. Tonight when you sang, God, that he's been so good to me, did you think about that only in the good things of life, or did those things that were difficult come to your mind as well? Because God is good to you regardless. God's not just good to you when things are the way we enjoy them and like them. And I'm thankful that he lets us have seasons like that. But when Paul said he wanted to know Jesus, he said, I want to know him in the power of his resurrection, which is, go Jesus. You rose from the dead. You overcame death, hell, and the grave. But then he said, but I also want to know him in the fellowship of his suffering. And that's hard. That's hard. It is hard to embrace suffering sometimes, or difficult times. But our culture says that comfort equals blessing, and avoiding pain is the goal of life. By the way, you are wired to avoid pain. Our body, and physical pain, but why do you think people go to certain things? Why do you think people go to substance abuse? Most people that get into substance abuse do not do it because they just wake up one day and say, I think I want to be addicted to something. They're trying to hide, they're trying to get away from something, and normally it's pain. That's the reason you hear people say, well, and I'm just using an example, my spouse left me and I went out and drowned my troubles in alcohol. They might not have done that otherwise. Does it make it right? No. But we are wired to try to avoid pain. By the way, that's the reason a lot of marriages fail, because they don't want the pain of having to work things out. Marriage, according to Hollywood, is supposed to be bliss. You're not supposed to have to work at that. It's all peaches and cream and roses and, all of that and fireworks and all of that stuff. And that's just not the way it is. Marriage is work. By the way, you find out real quickly when you get married that you're not as like each other as you thought you were when you were dating. You find that out real quick. And that's just one example. Yet Solomon, one of the wisest men who ever lived, comes to an entirely different conclusion. And Ecclesiastes 7 is unlike anything you'll hear from modern culture. Instead of saying better to laugh than cry, better to party than mourn, better to be popular than respected, Solomon repeatedly says things like this. He says better, but his better list sounds upside down. Only someone who has lived long enough to discover that appearances are deceiving could write those words. He had chased wealth, he had chased pleasure and power and knowledge and accomplishment. And Solomon finally says, let me tell you something that is really better. And so this chapter is less about explaining life and more about teaching us how to live wisely in a world when it doesn't make sense. So look at the first 6 verses. I love the first verse. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of one's birth. You already see the tension. You already see it's different than the world. He says that, better. Now, by the way, remember when you're reading this, that this is under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. This is what God told him to write. And that's very, very important. Verse 2, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to the heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than a man to hear the song of fools. For like the cracking of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment in verse 1. Notice Solomon's comparisons. He says better than expensive perfume. He said a good reputation. Perfume smells good for a while, right? But character lasts for a lifetime. The greatest thing people can say at your funeral isn't that he made a lot of money, or he drove a nice truck or a nice car, or lived in a big house, or she wore expensive clothes, but that he or she loved Jesus and were faithful. They could always be trusted. Think about it. In fact, Proverbs agrees. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches. Proverbs 22:1 says that. He says it's better to attend a funeral than a party. I had to look at that twice. I got to thinking about that. But remember this too. You got to go back to the context of the whole book. This is about life under the sun. This is not eternity. We have to make sure that when we read this, we're remembering Solomon is writing from all the things that he tried to make satisfy him under the sun, and he's trying to help us understand we have to see things in light of eternity. But yet it sounds strange, better to attend a funeral than a party. Now I hope you'll take me and no, I'm just kidding around tonight, but people have asked me before, would you rather do a funeral or a wedding? And I say a funeral, at least it's permanent. I don't have any promises that the marriage is going to be permanent. No matter how much I love them, know them, help them, you never know. But when I do a funeral, it's permanent. They're not going to come back and argue with me about anything. They're never going to ask me to counsel anymore. And yet I don't like to see people die. So please, if you just heard part of that, please understand what I'm saying. I'm halfway. But we look at a statement like that, and that's what you think of. Why would Solomon say, I'd rather attend a funeral than a party? And he explains. He says, for this is the end of all men, in verse 2, and the living will take it to heart. In other words, funerals force us to ask questions that parties never do. You go to a party, and the thing that you do is not go, well, I wonder if I live tomorrow. You go to a party, and most of the time, you're not going to think, what's in my life that I need to straighten out? You go to a funeral, there's a lot of people, it's the only time they think about their destiny. It's the only time they think about what's right or wrong in their life, or that could happen to me, or that could be me. Am I ready for that to be me? That happens all the time in funerals. The reason I give invitations at funerals. A lot better than giving them at weddings, because everybody's wanting to party. Hurry up, preacher, we got to go to the reception. But you got a captive audience at a funeral, and you give an invitation, they're thinking about their own mortality. He says, for instance, here's some of the things that you would ask at a funeral to your own self that you would never do at a party. Am I living for what matters? If today were my last, would I be ready? Here's one. What legacy am I leaving? You see, parties entertain us, funerals educate us. One distracts us, the other changes us. Then he says this, better sorrow than laughter. That's another one. I go, Solomon, what are you saying to us? You see, God isn't glorifying sadness. I don't want you to leave tonight thinking God just wants you to be miserable. That's not what Solomon's doing here. He's teaching that hardship often produces maturity. You will not become mature if your life is always easy. You just won't. James says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, James 1. And because he says trials produce perseverance, and comfort rarely changes us. In fact, comfort many times makes us covet and greedy for more comfort, and many people don't know how to handle it. Comfort rarely changes us. Difficulty often changes us. And so here's the application. You say, what's Solomon trying to say? And here's what I wrote down. I think what he's trying to say is this. Do not waste painful seasons in your life. Don't look at them as things that God is doing to you. Look at them as what God is doing for you. Don't waste painful seasons. Don't try to waste them away. Ask things like this, Lord, what do you want to teach me? Reveal to me what you want from my life. Instead of, Lord, why is this happening to me? We've all done that. We've all done that. I'm not getting on to you tonight if you've done that, because I've done that. Lord, why? Why is this happening? And again, I don't think he gets mad at us for asking, but I think he wants us to redirect our focus on, he's trying to help us. He allows it, and he will, it's the Romans 8:28 principle as well. We have a Romans 8:28 story in the Old Testament, and almost an Old Testament passage that is the New Testament, Romans 8:28. When the brothers came before Joseph, and Joseph revealed himself, and think about this. Joseph's father, they thought that Joseph was dead. There was famine. I mean, everything was against them. In fact, Joseph's father actually said, all these things are against me. But when Joseph brought his family, he eventually was able to speak into them, and this is what he said. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. And it changed. Listen, you don't think Joseph changed? By the way, Joseph wasn't that soft mama's boy that was trying to deceive everybody and was playing parents against his siblings, against his brothers when he was in Egypt. Prison, being captured, being enslaved, getting put in prison, and then what he learned when and obviously for Pharaoh to call him out and say, I need you to help me, understand what this is. Joseph was a different man when he looked at his family and said, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. He wouldn't have said that back as a teenage boy. And so Solomon reminds us, we just need to know that, don't waste the painful seasons. God's going to make you better. Number 2, in verses 17 through 14, this is what the Bible says. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other. By the way, let me go ahead and read. So that man can find out nothing that will come after him. See, we are quick when things are good to call it the act of God. But when it's bad, we call it the act of the devil. Now, I'm going to say something. We know the devil is evil, right? We all agree on that. But let me tell you something. You can't blame everything on the devil. You can't even blame him for everything. The Bible's, Paul said God gave him a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him. Job told Satan, now Satan was the perpetrator, but God allowed Job to be oppressed by Satan himself. And we go, why? I don't know why, other than Satan said, if you'll take your hand off of him, he'll curse you. Job never did. He never did. And God sustained him through all of that. And so the second thing we find in these verses is wisdom receives God's discipline. Verse 13 says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he's made crooked? Solomon reminds us that some things belong to God's sovereignty, and you're never going to explain them. One of the happiest days of my life was when I decided I didn't have to have all the answers. Because I'm not ever going to have all the answers, and neither are you. You're not going to have all the why questions answered. You will get some of them answered, but you will not get all of them answered. And you will stay frustrated if you can't walk by faith and go, Lord, I don't understand this, but I'm gonna surrender this to your sovereignty, and I'm going to keep living my life for you. Not every problem can be fixed. I think research has done this, and I don't know, maybe you married couples would say something different, but research has said, after studying a lot of marriages, that about a little over 60% of the marital problems will never be solved. That's the reason that good marriage counselor would teach you how to work through the ones that are necessary to be solved. But you think of some problems that you have fought over the years that still are not solved, and they never will be. And there's some things you just have to go, we're going to either agree to disagree, we're never going to solve this problem, and you move on and you fix those things and you work on those things that bring you closer together. There are some things that they're just not going to be solved. And I believe the Bible teaches that. Not every problem can be fixed. Not every mystery can be explained. Not every disappointment will make sense this side of heaven. And so, what do we do with that? Well, we accept both prosperity and adversity. I'll give you an example, and this example will help you know how to pray for me this week or next week. On Tuesday at 1:30, I will be speaking at the convention in a breakout seminar on guardians of innocence, addressing childhood sexual abuse in the church. It's never been talked about, as far as I know, at a national convention. And we've just now been allowed under Dr. Moody to be able to address this, and they've agreed to do that. And I'm just going to share some things from a perspective of a child that was a victim, a parent that had a son that was a victim, and a pastor that I led a church through that and what happened. But I'm going to tell you something. I'm just going to tell you tonight. I will never understand why my abuser and my son's abuser never faced justice. I will never understand that. I just won't. I don't understand that. I don't understand how a man can tell the authorities that he was not the only one. There were 9 or 10 other boys, and he goes back to his job as a greeter at Walmart because of statute of limitations. I will never understand why the state trooper says to my assistant pastor who called in the abuse on my son, and they say, we are recommending it to the Attorney General's office, who the Attorney General at the time was Joe Biden's son, Beau Biden, who is now dead, who ran his campaign on cleaning up childhood sexual abuse, and they would not take the case. And this man admitted it. It was not an accusation. He admitted it to 3 pastors in our church. Now, you may say tonight, I really did not tell y'all all that for you to come up and pat me on the back. We've been dealing with this ever since we knew it. And I had to come to a point where I may never get over it, but I've got to move past it. I can't live my life paralyzed because they're never going to face judgment this side of heaven. But let me tell you what I do know. God will set the record straight. He will set the record straight. And here's the good thing about it. It won't be vengeance. I won't have to deal with something that I take into my own hands. He'll set the record straight based on his character, not based on my anger. And Job knew that too, by the way. Job said, when he talked about the one on high, he said, I know he's keeping the record on high. Job knew. Job knew that when people were telling him, his own wife telling him, curse God and die, Job knew that God was keeping the record and that the good things that he did were extremely, important, and the bad things that were going to be dealt with. And so, extremely. I'll never, there's just things that I will never, ever understand. And so we have to accept both prosperity and adversity. In the day of prosperity, he says, verse 14, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. And what he says is, consider that they both happen. Surely God has appointed the one as well as the other. Both days come from God's permissive hand. Easy seasons reveal God's blessings. Hard seasons reveal God's wisdom. I really believe this. I believe sometimes when God allows hard seasons, he sees something in our life that needs to be sort of smoothed out. The same God who gives sunshine also sends rain. Both are necessary for growth. A farmer never complains if they're A balanced farmer never complains about rain after planting. Why? Because he knows growth requires both sunshine and storms. And neither do mature believers with both blessing and burdens. And so instead of asking why me, and I want you to know, I've asked those. I don't want to stand here and use that illustration tonight like I have handled this always perfectly. I haven't. I did early on. Annette and I both asked, what in the world, Lord, why would you let this happen to our children? Why? We've served you. We've done that. We had all that, those seasons. And yet, we're learning, instead of saying why us, why me, we learn to ask, what is God producing in me? When God uses difficult times to help us or to mold us, it doesn't mean he's okay with what happened. You got to remember that. God's not okay with what happened, but he wants to turn something very ugly into something very beautiful. And that's what he can do. That's what he can do that. And then number 3 in verse 15, look at verse 15. I have seen everything in my days of vanity. There's a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. There we go. You got a man living like the devil, lives long life. You got a man living for God and lives a short life. Doesn't make sense, does it? Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this. And also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. For there is not a just man on the earth who does good and does not sin. Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. You say, what's he trying to say? Well, wisdom avoids dangerous extremes. The passage has confused, including me, many readers. It's not teaching moderation in righteousness. We are to live as holy as the Lord will help us and as we are willing to live. But Solomon is warning against self-righteousness and arrogant wickedness. There's a huge difference. In other words, he's saying, don't trust your own goodness. See, self-righteous people believe that they deserve God's blessings. The humble realize that everything is by God's grace. Jesus condemned the Pharisees because they trusted in themselves. They thought they were good out of their own goodness. They thought they were who they were because of what they had accomplished and what they had done. And so don't trust your own goodness. Second thing, don't excuse sinful living either. He says, don't be overly wicked. Sin always produces freedom or promises freedom. Sin always promises freedom. It always produces bondage, and wisdom avoids both pride and rebellion. You don't get too proud of your holiness. You try not to live in rebellion either. You're going to sin, but you're striving not to. And so the other thing is, remember, everyone struggles, and that will help you with yourself. That will also help you not to judge others, to remember that not only do you struggle, they struggle. In fact, verse 20 levels the playing field. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. So what he's saying is there's no one just that does good. It would be like this today. There's no Christian that doesn't sin. There's no perfect people, no perfect marriages, no perfect churches, no perfect pastors, no perfect anything, you name it. No perfect church members, no perfect employer, no perfect employee, and everyone needs grace. Everyone needs grace. You give grace because you've received grace. Be patient with others because God has been patient with you. And then number 4, wisdom knows its own limitations. Wisdom knows its own limitations. Look at verse 23. All this I have proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. See, Solomon admits something remarkable here. He said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. I wasn't. The wisest man on earth basically said, I still don't understand everything. You ever met a know-it-all? You know, hopefully you don't live with one, but you ever met one? They just think they know it all. And that's a difference than being knowledgeable. You almost know a know-it-all because of their attitude. They may know a lot. But Solomon was wise in that he came to a conclusion that he still didn't know a lot of things. See, real wisdom is humble. Fools think they know everything. Wise people know that they don't. And then verse 29 gives a conclusion. Truly, this only have I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. The problem isn't God, the problem is humanity. We are the problem, not God. God created mankind good, but sin complicated everything. You know, there was a time that, have you ever heard somebody say this? Well, I sin because I'm human. No, you don't sin because you're human. You sin because humanity developed because of disobedience. There was a sin nature that began in man, but Adam and Eve were human and they were perfect. And so human beings now have a sinful nature, and that's the reason you sin, because you have a sin nature. And so God created man good, sin complicated everything, and life is broken. I want you to think about this. In the Garden of Eden, there was one wrong choice. One. There was one tree, one wrong choice. Every other choice was righteous except one. And out of that one, look at how many wrong choices you have now. You can't even count them. You can't even think that. I mean, we can't even think like that, how many wrong choices there are. And so life is broken because the world is broken. But even in a broken world, God still gives wisdom. In fact, James 1, I believe it's 5, says if we need wisdom, we can ask God for it, and he will give it to us liberally, and he upbraideth not. It means he will not withhold it, even if you haven't asked for it before. He's ready for you to ask for wisdom. And so how do we live that out? How do we live this out? If we know that adversity and prosperity come from the same hand, hardship and ease and comfort come from the same hand, how do we deal with all that? Well, number one, build your reputation more than your resume. Build your character more than your resume. Your greatest possession is your testimony. That is true. The greatest possession you have is your testimony as it relates to being a person. People should trust your word because they know your character. And by the way, you're not going to be perfect in that. Some people are not going to trust you no matter what you do. They didn't trust Jesus, and he never sinned. But the general idea is if you'll build your character, people will trust your word. Build your reputation before you spend so much time building your resume. Number two, let hardship become your teacher. Don't run from every difficult situation. Sometimes God's greatest classroom is suffering. Number three, receive both blessings and burdens from God's hand. Celebrate joyful seasons. We ought to. But trust God during the painful seasons. Both have purpose. Both have purpose. Think about some times when it was very difficult, and it might have come after a time of comfort and prosperity. And then all of a sudden you found yourself in a time of turmoil or a hard season. I bet if you think back, you'll think about some things that you've learned during those difficult days. Number 3, receive both blessings and burdens from God's hand. I think I said that one. Celebrate joyful seasons. Trust God during painful seasons, and remember both have purpose. Number 4, refuse pride. Never believe that you've arrived. Paul said that. Not that I have obtained, but I forget those things which are behind and press on toward the goal of the high calling in Christ Jesus. He said, I'm not going to live off the past. I'm not going to remember the past in the sense of, I think he meant it in a positive and a negative way. He didn't want to remember what he had done in the past before his salvation, and he did not live off of the successes of the past because he knew they would not sustain him in the future. They can encourage you, but you can't depend on them sustaining you or it happening again. So refuse pride. Stay teachable. Are you teachable? Are you willing to learn? And I just say this to all of us who are getting older. And there was a time I didn't say that about myself because I didn't think I was getting older. But I am getting older. I'm thinking it's hard for me to look back at my life now, and I realize it's only 60 years, but I can't hardly believe that in just a few months I won't have any children in their 20s. I mean, that's hard for me to believe. And got one, it won't be long till they're in the 40s. So just for me, and then whatever your age is, however long you've lived, you can still learn until you quit breathing. You can. You can still learn God's word. You can still learn things about life. You can. You can learn things about relationships. You can learn things about each other. You can. You can learn. You can, if you stay teachable and if you stay humble and stay dependent upon Christ. Lord, I can't do this on my own, but I can do it with you. Then number 5, extend grace to others. Since no one is without sin, choose forgiveness over criticism. I'm gonna be honest with you, the older I get, I'm tired of arguing with people. I just am. I just get tired of arguing with people. And I know sometimes you have to deal with things, but it's just not, it's not worth it. I tell my kids, we'll call and get into discussion, and sometimes I'll stop and go, I'm not arguing with you anymore. Or don't argue with me anymore. It's not that there's never a place for that. Please understand that. There are times that we have to discuss and have to work things out. But, I remember Danny Baer when he came and did the painting for us. He said, I'm just tired of judging people. He said, I don't want to live that life. I agree. And Jesus was so about that he looked at those righteous men that thought they were righteous, and he was standing by a woman who had probably done far more than any of us have ever done, and the man she was living with wasn't her husband, and he told them, drop your rocks. You don't have a right to throw these rocks. And they dropped them and went away, and she looked up, and Jesus said, where are your accusers? And he said, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And what a powerful illustration of forgiveness and helping, because let me tell you, forgiveness can help people get on the right track when they know they're not being condemned. And show the same mercy that you've received. Have you ever received mercy? Have you ever done somebody wrong and they showed mercy instead of judgment? Show the same mercy that you've received. Then number 6, live with eternity in view. There it is again, under the sun, living in eternity. A wise person remembers that life is short. Here's something, invest in the things that will outlive you. One of the things I'm learning about my children and grandchildren, and what I'm learning about the children in this church, and I want to challenge us adults tonight. One of the reasons you want to invest in the children of this church is because you're investing in a generation you will not see. You won't see them. There'll be a day that you're gone and I'm gone, and what we put into them now, and I have to ask myself all the time, do I want what I want, or do I want them to love the Lord and love church? And it might look a little different than what it looks for me. Not in the main things, not in the way they become Christians, but in the way they live out their faith. It's going to look a little different. By the way, it looks a little different for you than the way your parents did it. I'm sorry, it might not be much different, but it's probably different. I know, it was for us. And that doesn't make them wrong and us right. It makes us different. And there's some things that certainly need to remain the same, but live with eternity in mind and remember that we can invest in things that we will not see, like faith and family, the gospel, discipleship, the kingdom of God. Ecclesiastes 7 teaches us that wisdom is often found where the world least expects it. It grows through sorrow. It matures through correction. It deepens through humility, and it trusts God when answers are unavailable. You see, the cross itself proves this truth. What looked like history's greatest tragedy became history's greatest. God often accomplishes his greatest work, though what initially appears to be life's greatest loss. I read this story and I thought I would share it in closing tonight. It's called the Chinese bamboo tree. One of the most remarkable plants in the world is the Chinese bamboo tree. After the seed is planted, it must be watered and cared for faithfully. The first year, nothing. The second year, nothing. The third year, nothing. The fourth year, still no visible growth. Most people would assume that the seed had died and stopped watering it. But the gardener who understands bamboo keeps tending it faithfully. Then something during the fifth year, something extraordinary happens. In just a matter of weeks, the bamboo can shoot up to 80 to 90 feet in the air in the fifth year. The question is, did it grow 90 feet in a few weeks? The answer is no. It had been growing for years beneath the surface. During those seemingly unproductive years, it was developing an extensive root system strong enough to support the tremendous growth that would eventually come. And by the way, God often works the same way in our lives. During seasons of grief and waiting and disappointment and correction and unanswered prayer, we may feel as though nothing is happening. Where are you, God? Why is this not happening? Why do I have to go through this? Why aren't I getting better? But beneath the surface, God is strengthening our faith. He's deepening our character. And he's building spiritual roots that will sustain future faithfulness. You see, Ecclesiastes 7 reminds us that God's greatest work is often invisible before it becomes visible. Wisdom is formed quietly. Over time, through experiences we would never have chosen, but later we recognize as God's tools for shaping us. So maybe tonight you're in a difficult season. Don't assume that God's forgotten you. God hadn't forgotten you. He may be doing his deepest work where nobody can see it. Trust him. Remain faithful when you can't see him or hear him. Job said, I looked above and I couldn't see him. I looked beneath and I could not perceive him. I looked to the left and to the right and he was not there, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, my God. See, Galatians tells us, and let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not faint or we do not lose heart. When the wise life is not the easiest life. It is the God-centered life. So ask the Lord today for the kind of wisdom that values character over comfort, embraces his discipline, walks humbly in his grace, will trust his purposes even when life doesn't make sense. And when we do, we discover that God's wisdom is not merely information for the mind, it is transformation for the heart and a guide for everyday faithful living. That's what Ecclesiastes 7 is about. It's not an easy lesson. It's by far an easy lesson. And I don't know, I have no clue other than sometimes we share with each other. what season of life you're in. And I'm not talking about an age group. I'm talking about, I don't know what season you're in. You may be in a very, very good season of comfort, ease. I hope you are, but you may not be there. It may be a season of hardship, a season of unrest, a season where there's anxiety and worry, a season of health issues. I mean, you just name it. I think about, we've had a lot of conversation over the last few years with people that are pondering retirement. That's a different season. You think about you've worked all your life and then one day you get up and you don't go back there. I've thought about, I don't think I'm ready to, I might not live to be tomorrow. I don't think I'm ready to give up now, but I am. Let me tell you, I won't be preaching the same number of years as I've already preached. I won't. That's part of that season is gone. And I've thought a lot about, Lord, what are you going to do with me in the last part of my life? You say, well, preacher, you may live 25, 30 more years. I may, but that's still not as long as I've already lived. I mean, I'm not worried about it. I'm sort of like A.B. Brown years ago in theology class. He said, I'm ready to go to heaven, but if you get in a bus load up today, I'd rather just wait a little bit. He wanted to see his kids and grandkids and all that, and that's sort of where I am. I hope I get to live long enough to enjoy my grandkids and, see them grow up and that kind of. But that doesn't mean I can't be ready. It just means that we're all in different seasons of life. And they come with challenges. And they come with sometimes hardship and sometimes comfort. And usually God doesn't let us stay in a season of hardship because he knows what we can take and what we can handle. Any season. In the season we're in. Any thoughts, comments? That must mean you are ready to go home.
As far as attending a funeral instead of a wedding.
Yeah.
People in a funeral need comfort.
Mm-hmm.
A wedding, everyone's just having a good time.
Yeah.
So the Lord wants us to comfort those who need it.
Yeah. And I will admit, even knowing some of your stories, there's things that you've been through that I can't imagine, and I've never been through, and vice versa. But that's the reason wisdom tells us, like you go to a funeral and maybe you've never lost somebody, or maybe you have, and you know what it means to need to comfort or the need for comfort.
I know it's important to have a good testimony and everything, but in my opinion, funerals for the living, not for the dead person.
It is. You're right. It is.
It's not what I'm doing when I die, it's over.
Right.
But a funeral is for the living people, for those who are mourning, those who are remembering.
I will usually open a funeral somewhere in the opening comments. I will usually say, there's not anything else I can do for the person. But what I can share today can do something for you. And especially when you're doing a funeral where you're not sure. And the only reason I take those kind of funerals is so I can share the gospel. And I will be up front with the family. I've done some funerals where I didn't believe they were believers. But I can share the gospel with a group of people that need to hear it. And I can still bring comfort. Even people, if they really need comfort. If they know anything about eternity and their loved one was not a Christian, they need comfort as well, just for the possibilities. So it's a good example, very good example. Anything else? Now, I wish I had a camera to take your pic, because I know all of you are pondering. I can see it. It's like, this was, Ecclesiastes 7 is a little bit heavy. Yes. Yeah. Well, I remember the little story, and I might not can tell. I wish I had it and I could read it because you guys would get tickled at it. But it was about a guy that he wanted to go with his friend to see the king, and they told him he went to the king, and they said, "Well, these kings are, these people are cannibals," and so he came back, and he. I'll have to read it to you. It was where he ended up in jail because he wouldn't do something, and it ended up that the thing that would have been bad was good, and it had to do with he didn't have a thumb, and cannibals will not eat people if they are deformed. And that's pretty accurate. Even missionaries will tell you if there is a deformity, they think it's evil. They will think it will bring, and so if you're missing a limb or you're missing, they won't mess with you. And so the guy, he said, well, I lost my thumb, and he said, oh, that's bad. And he said, no, that's good. And he said, well, why is that good? And he said, well, if I hadn't lost my thumb, I'd have been with you. And he was talking about how he had to run from the cannibals, but he didn't have to because he was deformed. So I like what Paul said. Sometimes it's a matter of perspective, but I'll bring that story because I think y'all would like it, and it would go along probably with Ecclesiastes anyway. So anything else before we go? All right. I hope this will give you something to think about, and when you're going through different seasons of life, you'll be able to maybe have a little different perspective. And probably all of you in here already have a good perspective anyway, and this will just be a good reminder. But let's stand and pray. Father, we thank you today